Now, did you know that the first albums from prog rock's biggest names like King Crimson and ELP shaped music history? Get ready to hear mind-blowing tracks that push the boundaries of rock forever. Now, whether you're new to prog or a lifelong fan, prog rock icons, debut albums you need to hear is your guide to hear the beginnings from this incredible genre. Progressive rock or prog rock is one of the most creative and influential styles of music to come out of the late 60s and 1970s. It's known for its long songs, experimental sounds, and talented musicianship. The genre blended rock with elements of classical, jazz, and even folk music, creating something totally different from 3-minute pop songs of the time that we were used to. Now, for many, prog rock was more than just music. It was a journey, often telling stories or exploring deep themes. Now, if you're someone who adores prog or just getting curious about the genre, it's important to know where it all started. The debut albums of some of the biggest prog rock bands set the stage for the music that would follow. These albums didn't just introduce the bands, they defined the sound of a new musical movement. Firstly, you may hear me refer to the Big Six. Well, just to clarify, this was a collective term for the bands that were often associated with the golden era from the prog rock genre in the early 70s and featured the bands Yes, Genesis, Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd, ELP and King Crimson. So let's take a look at the first albums from each of the Big Six. Now, each of these bands created music that still resonates with fans today, and their debut albums are a great starting point to dive into the world of prog rock with me. So starting off with the Yes album, Yes actually, from 1969, this band was formed in London, England in 1968. It was simply called Yes, and that was the first album that was released in 1969. The band was John Anderson on vocals, Chris Squire on bass, Peter Banks on guitar, Tony Kaye on keyboards, and Bill Bruford on the drums. This album showcased the band's unique blend of rock and more complex musical arrangements, though it wasn't as fully developed as some of their later work. Now, this album set the stage for what would come in the future, with tight musicianship and some of the best melodic elements that would become their signature sound. The track often regarded as the best on this album is Survival. It's a good example of their earlier sound with beautiful melodies, strong musicianship and lyrics that hinted out at the grand themes that they would explore in later works. It's a must listen for anyone curious about Yes's beginnings. Now I turn to Genesis and Trespass from 1970. These guys were also formed in England but had a very different sound in their early days compared to their later, more pop-orientated work. Their debut album, From Genesis to Revelation in 1969, wasn't much of a hit, but the second album, Trespass, from 1970, that's the one we're focusing on, and this is where their prog rock identity started to take shape. At this point, the band consisted of Peter Gabriel on vocals, Tony Banks on the keyboards, Anthony Phillips on guitar, Mike Rutherford on bass, and John Mayhew on drums. Trespass was an album that was filled with long, complex songs that combined folk and rock with some dark and mysterious undertones. The standout track from Trespass is genuinely considered to be The Knife. It's a really powerful song with dramatic changes in mood and tempo, showing off the band's ability to blend aggression with melody. The Knife also marked the first time Genesis leaned into perhaps that theatrical side of their performances, something Peter Gabriel would expound on in later albums. King Crimson now and in the Court of the Crimson King, and this was released in 1969. Now, their debut album is often hailed as one of the defining records of prog rock. I'm not going to argue with that whatsoever. Released in 1969, it was groundbreaking in how it mixed heavy rock with orchestral elements, jazz influences, and darker, more complex themes. The band was led by guitarist Robert Fripp, with Greg Lake, later of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, another one of our Big Six bands, on vocals, and bass, Michael Giles on drums, Ian MacDonald on reeds and woodwind, and Peter Sinfield was writing the lyrics. This album is often described as a masterpiece, and many consider the track 21st Century Schizoid Man to be the best on the album. It's loud, chaotic, with an intense song and a mixture of jazz and heavy rock that was unheard of at the time. The song also has political undertones, a sign that prog could be more than just musical experimentation. It could also deliver a message. Now, Emerson, Lake and Palmer's self-titled debut from 1970, we'll refer to them as ELP, and these guys were a supergroup made up of three extremely talented musicians: Keith Emerson on the keyboards, Greg Lake on vocals and bass, and Carl Palmer on drums. This self-titled debut album came out in 1970 and was a big hit, thanks to its mix of classical influences, rock and jazz again. The track Lucky Man became their most famous song from this album. It's a relatively simple acoustic ballad compared to the band's later, more complex works, but it became a hit on the radio. The song has that iconic synth solo at the end, performed by Keith Emerson, and this was revolutionary at the time and showed how progressive rock could push those boundaries of what prog could and might sound like. Jethro Tull's debut was an album called This Was in 1968, and this really had a very different sound from the progressive rock style the band would adopt later on. Led by Ian Anderson, who's been there throughout, who played the flute and sang, the band originally had a really blues-based sound with a mix of jazz. At the time of This Was, the band also included Mick Abrahams on guitar, Clive Bunker on drums, and Glenn Cornick on bass. Now, while it wasn't full-on prog, you can hear hints of where the band was probably heading. The standout track on the album is My Sunday Feeling, and this shows off Anderson's flute playing, and that was quite a unique feature in rock music at the time, as well as the band's overall energy. Now, as Jethro Tull evolved, their later albums would fully embrace prog, but This Was is an interesting look at their earlier sound. Pink Floyd released The Piper at the Gates of Dawn in 1967, and they are one of the most well-known prog bands. They would become even more famous for the later works like Dark Side of the Moon and The War. This debut album was released in 1967 and is very much a product of the psychedelic era. At the time, the band was led by Syd Barrett, who wrote most of the songs. The rest of the band included Roger Waters on bass, Richard Wright on keyboards, and Nick Mason on the drums. Barrett's influence made this album quirky and strange, with lots of experimental sounds and surreal lyrics. The track Astronomy Domini is often seen as the best on the album, representing the spacey, otherworldly sound that Pink Floyd would later expand on in their career. It's a song that hints at the prog direction the band would take after Barrett's departure. The debut albums of the Big Six offered a glimpse into those early days of a genre that would go on to change the face of music during the 70s. Now, whether you're a long-time fan or just starting to explore, these albums are essential listening. They show the roots of progressive rock and give us a sense of the talent and creativity that would define the genre for years to come. Each album has that standout track that reflects the band's early sound and potential. These are not just tracks, not just songs, but they are experiences, taking listeners on a journey that's unique to prog rock. Now, if you haven't heard these albums yet, now's the perfect time to dive in and see how prog rock legends started their musical journeys. The next video I'll be scheduling is a look at a specific track from one of these bands mentioned in this video, as I start a series of deconstructing the best classic tracks for you. And if this has been posted, it will be on screen. It'll be on screen now. Now, if it's not there just yet, it soon will be, so click the notification bell and stay subscribed so you'll know when it gets released. I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye for now.